So the last 2 days, I got about 7 different text messages from people, all sending me articles about you for leaving the Conservative Rabbinic Union for officiating interfaith weddings. What was
Right.
interesting is usually when I get a blitzkrieg of students and friends of mine sending me articles, usually they're all on one side. So usually it's, oh my God, did you see this piece in the New York Times? It's so upsetting. Or, oh my God,
Right.
did you see this article? It's so incredible. What was so interesting about this moment is half the people sending it to me, it was like exclamation points. This is so great. I love that this is happening. And then the other half of people sending this to me and they're like, what the hell is happening in the non-Orthodox world? For
Amazing. I love it. I love that.
so
Yeah,
I would love to get into this for people that have not
sure.
yet seen the article or know who you are or know why you are now seemingly one of the centers of Jewish controversy. Can you just talk a little bit about
Yeah.
what prompted all this?
Okay. So first off, Rabbi Levine, Rabbi Daniel, Rabbi
Yeah,
Levine.
Daniel's great.
Okay, Daniel. Then I'm Ari. It's a pleasure to meet you. And I am a third generation, now I guess former conservative rabbi, although not really. If I really think about who I am at the core, no matter what assembly I may be a part of or not a part of, I'm a conservative rabbi. I was So third generation, my grandfather, Rabbi Alexander Shapiro, was the president of the Rabbinical Assembly, which I just left in the mid-1980s, was very instrumental in ensuring the ordination of women went through within the conservative movement. My father, Rabbi Moshe Saks, who is still a practicing rabbi, he was very involved, especially at Camp Ramah in the Poconos, was involved in the Vada Kashrut for the conservative movement in Philadelphia, which happened to be, as far as I know, the only city where there was a Vada Kashrut for by conservative Jews, that there were so many conservative Jews who wanted kosher food there. That was in the 90s or so. And I grew up in the movement. I'm a movement kid. I did Ramah, USY, Nativ, conservative yeshiva, the Jewish Theological Seminary, both for List College and for Rabbinical School, and did a Machon Shechter when I was in Rabbinical School. Had two full-time pulpits after I finished Rabbinical School. The last one ended in 2023. And yet, I would say that my rabbinate was really defined by something I kind of discovered about what it means for me to be a Jew in America, and especially a conservative rabbi in America, coming from my call to be a rabbi, which is also part of deciding to live in America as opposed to making Aliyah to Israel. And that is to see if in this part of the world that all these different faith traditions and cultures and ways of living life, if we can actually get along, if we can actually live together in some capacity, such a great opportunity to do that in America. And the best place to really see how that might happen is within the context of interfaith families who have two different traditions. They're trying to figure out how to make that work. And that was what I felt my call was. And ever since that moment, about 15 years ago, when I was actually ironically in Israel, I've been thinking about what's the conservative Jewish pathway to understand how that's even possible. And I think I found it. But what I'm so sad about is that I couldn't share it in my movement. It is the pathway that I believe my movement trained me to find, and I couldn't share it there.
It seems like whenever talking about intermarriage, there's sort of two different ways to view it in the category of American Jews who are not against it, right? So obviously, if we're talking about, the entire Orthodox community and much of the conservative movement, they are just unequivocally against it. This is not even a conversation they'll entertain. For people that are in the non-Orthodox world or non-halachically observant world and are entertaining it, just to spell out for listeners, Halakhic concept 101, there's a concept of halacha, lechatchila and b'diavad. So just for listeners that have never heard of this concept before, lechatchila, or a priori, if I use a spoon that was used for meat 2 weeks ago and I accidentally eat cereal with it, nobody would tell me a priori that's ahead of time, but I can still eat the cereal.
Right.
Right. And so that would be, lechatchila, it's not okay. But once you do it, it's sort of looked at retroactively as like, okay, fine, it's not worth making us think about this. So I've seen some people start to view interfaith weddings or intermarriage in terms of that b'diavad. And the argument would go as follows. And I'm curious, because it doesn't sound like this is what you're saying, but one type of argument could go as follows. Listen, the reality in the non-halachically observant American Jewish community is that 60 to 70% of people are not going to marry Jews. We don't want to lose them as Jews in the Jewish community. Probably the fastest way to lose somebody in the Jewish community is if they marry somebody not Jewish and essentially saying, screw you, we're not going to the wedding, we're not helping out as rabbis. And so therefore we shouldn't do that. But still, if somebody asks us a priori, hey, rabbi, should I look to marry a Jew? The answer would be yes, according to that argument. You don't seem to be saying that. You seem to be even one step over. You seem to be saying like there is no benefit for a Jewish person marrying a Jew. I'm curious if you can spell out that thesis, because I think that might be even more interesting to
So you say
people than
there's no benefit for a Jew to marry a Jew?
yeah, meaning if I'm a student coming to you, I
Yeah.
generally think in terms of college students because that's who I work with, and so
Hmm.
I get asked this question a
I
lot
love
in
college
terms of
students.
students dating Jews or non-Jews and trying to
Right.
figure all this out. And somebody asks me point blank,
Hmm.
you know, is it better for me to marry somebody who's Jewish? My answer is always going to be yes, right? There's a different story if a student comes to me and says, I am getting married to somebody not Jewish, now what, right? My answer probably will not be the classic Orthodox answer, which essentially is, so sorry, you're beyond some pale. But you seem to be making an argument that that answer initially to the student might be no. I just want to make sure I understand you correctly.
Our relationship with Hashem and our understanding of what it means to be put into certain situations is that we're here in a moment, and who knows why we're here, except that maybe there's something to take advantage of in that moment. So there's actually a quote that I have on my wall that I got from my time with 18 Doors, is Rukin Fellowship for rabbis who are interested in how to serve the needs of interfaith families, and they kind of gave it to us at the end. There's a great quote that says, "Umi yodea im le'et kazot higa ala malchut," which refers to Queen Esther, who, by the way, Queen Esther married a non-Jew. Achashverosh is a non-Jew. And by the way, she married a non-Jew before Mordechai met Haman. Therefore, she married a non-Jew, probably was forced to, that's a huge piece of it, but was not married to the non-Jew specifically for the purpose of saving the people of Israel. She wasn't hired. She wasn't like asked to do that. In fact, it wasn't until later on that there was an opportunity to be able to do it. So I'm not focused on how it happened at first. I'm focused on the reality that occurs when it happens. And I'll give an example of what this is, right? Especially thinking about college students. Rabbi Erwin Kula from Klal, which is an organization in New York, he was giving a seminar to a bunch of us as rabbis who were interested in how we push our borders. It's called Rabbis Without Borders. This was when I was still in rabbinical school a number of years ago. And he asked the question, he said, what do Jews do the most? I said, well, Hanukkah. Nope. Shabbat. Nope. Go to college. The thing that most Jews do in America is they go to college. What happens in college? Take a class, sitting next to somebody cute. You just hit it off. You're in the right dorm. There's all these different moments that happen, and we don't necessarily know why, except for this. We put ourselves in position in living in America, in deciding to live in a culture as part of the wider world where we're not closing ourselves off. We're not living in Mea Sharim. We're not living in a closed door community whereby it is impossible for us to really meet somebody who is different. The opportunity here is it's not about which is right or which is wrong. A friend of mine just asked me the question about my own family in terms of my kids. I have my own personal understanding of what I would want for my kids, and it may or may not necessarily have to do with what I think of when it comes to this issue at large. Because the truth is, I am relatively agnostic when it comes to the moment in which you discover who your soulmate is. But what I am saying is that that is a beautiful moment when you discover it. And my job as a rabbi is to welcome you, to welcome your partner, and to say, Umi yodea le'et kazot higat lamakom hazeh, that you came to this moment and there's something special here. That's what's so amazing about this opportunity. If we see it as an opportunity, as opposed to seeing it as the death of our people.
Yeah, I think what I was saying before, and by the way, I love the Queen Esther quote. I thought you were actually going to go. I mean, one of the funny things you get reading Tanakh is that virtually everyone marries somebody who's not Jewish. I mean, you don't even need to go all the way to Queen Esther. It's like, there were, if we do have this idea that Abraham was the first Jew, that means him and none of his kids essentially married Jews. Moses, of course, doesn't marry somebody Jewish. King Solomon, we can probably, talk for an hour about how many non-Jews he married.
Mm-hmm.
And so clearly there was something different happening in the biblical period than, what we call as sort of rabbinic Judaism. Maybe we can go back to that a little bit later. It
Sure.
sounds like you still are talking a little bit sociology. In other words, you're sort of, there are two poles, and one pole is saying, listen, this is the reality for American Jews. The reality is 90%, let's just make up a statistic, 90% of non-Orthodox American Jews who are within public school and go to normal college are going to end up meeting somebody who might not be Jewish. And so, like, that's the reality. The other poll is essentially saying, okay, therefore, if I have Jewish kids, I never want them interacting within, you know, a non-Jewish mainstream. And, you know, I only want them going to Jewish schools and Jewish camps and Jewish youth programs. The answer in the middle, so the pushback that I want to give is just because something might be slightly sociologically inevitable isn't an argument for the sort of ethical imperative of that thing, right? So, you know, the famous, you know, is an ought, you know, you can't derive an ought from an is, right? So just because many Jews are marrying people who aren't Jewish, that doesn't necessarily follow that then we ought to be helping them in those interfaith journeys. So I'm curious, you know, what you think about that in terms of if somebody says, like, listen, I agree with you and we shouldn't write off people, right? So perhaps I disagree with certain sects of the Jewish community who essentially say, okay, you've married somebody not Jewish. Okay, goodbye. Like, you know, we're never going to see you again. We're not going to give you an aliyah if you come to shul. We're going to sort of like half shun your kids, obviously, depending on, you know, which parent is Jewish is obviously a big one also. But on the other hand, not this sort of open condoning of saying like, yeah, it's all the same. It's all going to work out. Meaning I have a similar approach, and I'm curious to hear what you think of this, and please push back if you disagree. The vast majority of people I work with, either students or when I worked as a rabbi in a community members, do not practice Shabbat and kosher to the same standard that I personally practice.
Right.
In an ideal world, is everybody doing that? Yes. Is the fact that students are not doing that going to keep me from caring for them, loving them, wanting to support them, wanting to join them on their journey, even if a student says, I promise you I will never in my life stop eating In-N-Out because it's so delicious, right? That's not going to change my disposition towards that person. And so intermarriage can simply be, you know, one of those other things, which is, you know, listen, there's a reality in the American Jewish community, which is that, you know, X number of people are going to be doing this. That's different than me sort of writing a blank check of, you know, I will support everything you do. But also, if somebody does it, for me to say, listen, I'm still a pluralist, right? Like if I go to your house or you go to my house, even if I have different standards than you, I still care about you and love you. And it's not, you know, I don't want a closed off community. So that might be a little bit of a middle ground. And I'm curious because that's sort of how I've been thinking about this lately. I'm sort of also giving a little bit of my own feelings because I told you this offline. I mean, the reality is I think that this is an incredibly difficult, especially from people coming from more of the a traditional background. It's such a difficult journey. And I have friends of mine who grew up actually in the Orthodox community, I obviously won't say their names, who have actually married people who aren't Jewish. And I've seen how both the friend group and families, you know, go into full-on crisis mode. And so obviously some smoothing over of that would be a little bit better. All the way on the other hand, where for your average American Jew who's never thought twice about, you know, oh, maybe there is some benefit for me marrying within Judaism, I also want to push that person, especially if they're not dating or married yet. You know, I would never go to a 40-year-old who's been happily married for 10 years and be like, you know what? You know, it kind of feels, but right? Like, but
why not? You can do it. It's fine.
Exactly, right? But like if you're an 18-year-old freshman coming into college and you've never really had a serious boyfriend or girlfriend relationship and you're starting to think about what your life might look like when you're 30 for the first time, that person I do want to sort of challenge to think, you know, hey, if you want your life to be infused with a certain amount of Jewishness, it would perhaps, you know, be a benefit for you to look to marry somebody Jewish. I would love to get your thoughts on all those things.
Do you want to go Halakhic or do you want to go sociological?
Let's go sociologic and then we'll go Halakhic.
All right. 2 stories. First is my own. My first girlfriend was not Jewish. All right. My first girlfriend was not Jewish because I was the son of a rabbi. And let's just say
that explains the whole thing. You don't even need to finish the story.
Exactly. Like everybody knows it. If you're the son of a rabbi, it's like, do you really want to put yourself in that position? Like you're 15, 16, whatever it might be. Fascinating story in terms of how I met her, but that's for maybe another time. The result for the purpose of what we're talking about here is that we started to date. And relatively soon afterwards, I discovered the fact I only want to date Jews. It was something important to who I am. Something important to what is it that I needed personally. And I think that for anyone, regardless of how old necessarily they are, that trying to figure out who it is that they would want to be able to date or to get engaged with or to marry, you go through these questions about like, is this the right person for me? And faith, tradition, tribe, absolutely can play a significant role in what that might be. By the way, sometimes we talk about lots of different intermarriages. I could never do an intermarriage with myself and a Dallas Cowboys fan. Impossible. Like, I'm sorry, but go Birds. Like, I'm from Philly. That's not going to happen. There are certain things it's like you just can't do it. And in fact, in many ways, marriages are about an intermarriage in some capacity. My wife, we both went to Camp Ramah. We both did List College. We're both shul goers in terms of our own religious style. And we have a very different conception of God that, you know, changes some of the aspects of what does it mean for us to do Jewish in our own lives, personally, and also even with our family. Every marriage is some kind of intermarriage. So that's one sort of piece to it. And we should have the right to be able to decide what are the things that are important. In terms of the people who matter to us, we should have people who, I wouldn't say necessarily push back, but trusted people to say, like, is this who, like, tell me, is this right for you? Okay. Second story, though. Now I'm a rabbi. Meet a couple who they get married. Judaism was not necessarily something big to him. And, but seemed like her religion also was not necessarily big to her. They plan on not including much of religion at all in their family life till they had kids. And when they had kids, one of them, like the Catholic member of the family, the Catholic spouse said, you know what, I kind of want to send our kid to Catholic school. I had a great experience there. And all of a sudden, for the first time, the Jewish spouse was saying, I think I want more Judaism for my kid. I think I want to have that Judaism there. If my child's going to get the Catholic thing, I want the Jewish thing too. And now someone who hasn't really thought about much about what it means to be Jewish in previously is now asking themselves a lot about what it means to be Jewish because, again, of that opportunity that I've seen many couples who they marry somebody because they're Jewish or because they're Israeli and the other is Israeli, and they break up because they really weren't meant for each other. It was just the fact that they were Jewish or Israeli and they weren't necessarily going to be involved at all. In other words, the reason why you get married is for so many different kinds of reasons. And faith and religion is about the opportunity that is there. It is not necessarily about choosing beforehand what it is that it has to be, because we're then not open to what Hashem is opening our minds to and opening our eyes to in that moment. You know, the hardest thing I found with I'm not sure, because Daniel, you said that you teach college, right? You're teaching courses.
Yeah.
The hardest thing I find is for people to actually want to learn. Because if you learn, it means you're open to new ideas. You're open to something different. You're open to, I never thought about it this way. And if we actually learn something, it's like then Hashem is coming out of that text, whatever that text may be. And so being able to take an opportunity to say, wow, here is a chance to learn something. Here's a chance to do something that maybe I was never actually wanting to do before. I think, again, there's a great opportunity there. And that's the sociological piece, that we put ourselves in positions we may not necessarily know why it happens, or we're not necessarily trying to, but it happens. And now the choice is, how do we take it? As an opportunity or as something that is painful and a problem?
The story with the Jew and Catholic having a kid, that almost seems like a sad story to me, meaning there is some, and again, if you disagree, I would love to hear it, but especially between, let's say, Judaism and Catholicism, it sort of is a zero-sum game revolving around Jesus, unless you're not taking either faith seriously. But let's assume, I mean, it's one thing if you're culturally Christian or culturally Jewish, and, you know, sure, you can light Hanukkah candles and have a Christmas tree and, you know, whatever, if you're not taking the truth claims of the religion seriously. But let's imagine you want to take the religious tradition seriously. I imagine if you're going to Catholic school, there's some serious theology attached to that. And, well, depending on the Jewish school, you know, that's sort of a little bit more, you know, a much wider range. But there, at some point, there is going to be some concrete thing of, do you teach your kid that, you know, faith revolves around this figure Jesus, or do you not? I mean, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of room for the same type of pluralism as, let's say, you and your wife, or, you know, I'll add my wife and I as well. You know, she's Sephardi, I'm Ashkenazi. You know, we also probably had different conceptions of Jewish law and God and all of these things, but that's at least within a, you know, Overton window where it's manageable. And, you know, yes, sure, I'm sure our kids will be a little bit confused, but there's sort of at least, you know, bounds on how much we're going to confuse them. I could imagine if my partner was a religious Christian or a Christian and they were sent to, you know, some summers they went to Jewish camp and then other, you know, during the school year they're going to Catholic school. That just seems like an impossible situation. Now, again, it once someone's already doing it, right? Like if I meet somebody and they're a 40-year-old couple and they have a 6-year-old and they say, you know, hey, my kid is going to Catholic school, but I would also love for them to get some Jewish education. I've actually taught many students like that. I taught Hebrew school for a number of years, and it was actually fascinating the number of students who came They were all high schoolers, straight from the local Catholic school. Again, unclear if they were doing it because of, college prep or because, some of them were the results of a, interfaith marriage. But these kids were, I mean, they were great kids, but they were a little bit confused. I mean, just in terms of what to think about the world, and not in the type of good confusion of, yes, part of learning is being confused, but they're being told an extremely dogmatic version of how to, say, read the Bible in the morning. And then this was, a non-Orthodox Hebrew school. So I was giving them sort of the, liberal, metaphorical, this is going to be, important for your life and your heritage and, very open-ended and interpretive methodology of, how, what do you think, the story of the Garden of Eden means? How does this relate to your life? And this was just confusing for all the reasons that I think are obvious for listeners. So, there also is a differentiation. And then I do want to get to kids in a second. So I'll ask you that next. Which is
I want to make sure I address this before
sure. So I won't bounce around. I'll stay on this. But just to spell out one more thing, if there's two parents of sort of like no faith, right? So if a Jew is, I'm thinking like what was the guy's name? Mendel with the Peapods, right? If the dominant gene is Jewish and the other faith is just sort of, working in the background or non-existent, and the Jewishness can kind of overpower the, latent cultural Protestantism that, most American non-Jews have, that's one thing. But if both parents are interested in their faith, that just seems like a whole other ballgame of, how are you going to manage this at all? So throw it back to you.
This is where I would ask for people, if they're interested, to hear how I believe it's possible. They don't have to be confused. Check out the first season of the podcast that I do together with my Christian colleague and co-host, Anna DeWeese, who is the daughter of a Methodist minister, the son of a rabbi, daughter of a Methodist minister. She was at Union Theological Seminary. I was at the Jewish Theological Seminary. We taught together at the Interfaith community of New York, which was a school dedicated to teaching kids who identify both as Jewish and Christian, Judaism and Christianity. Sometimes she led, sometimes I led, but we were always there in the room to offer commentary. A basically pre-B'nai Mitzvah kid said in that space, when we were talking about Jesus and they were talking about God from the Torah and trying to understand how does this work, he was like, yeah, everybody's got different ways of understanding God. Okay, it makes sense. That is a deeper way of understanding God. It's a non-dogmatic way. And I don't mean even metaphorical. I mean, the fact is that if there is a God, how much do we really know about God? One of the main classes I took in college, it was my freshman year at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I was a Bible major. It was called Bible 1009. And the short of it was, did God write the Torah? That's the essence of the class. And I just did an episode about a week or so ago with my best friend and one of my roommates from college. And he actually spoke about the fact that we met in that class. And when I heard that the fact that God did not write the Torah, I could not understand it. It just didn't make sense to me. This 13-year-old kid, only time in my life I've ever seen a 13-year-old kid understand how you can have a way in which God is real in texts that are different and that have different ways of being able to express something bigger, and that it's a human way of understanding it. Only the time I ever heard a 13-year-old do that was someone who was actually learning from two different traditions. Because one way to also think about it is that it's two different languages. Yeah, it might be that when you're first learning different languages, it's hard to be able to speak both languages the same way early on in your life. But once you figure out how to be able to be bilingual, to speak two different languages, you understand language better. You're able to think in different ways because you translate in different ways depending upon where you might be. Now, we can talk for a long time about it back and forth. And I would also ask for people to recognize that there are these different ideas about what we call the myths of interfaithing. The very first season of the podcast, which is the core idea, it lays out 6 different myths related to why it is that the intermarriage could not work. Okay, and we're talking primarily between Jews and Christians, but it could be also related to other different groups together. The first one is that Judaism and Christianity just don't mix. You got the Jesus thing, you got the Hashem thing, they just don't mix. The second one, you're going to confuse the kids. Third one is that Well, it's just not going to work. Like, how do you deal with it on a logistical level? You know, Sundays here, Saturdays there. Like, are we really expecting people to be able to do that? The next one has to do with the fact that if people marry somebody from a different faith tradition, they're often seen as disloyal, that they're a traitor. How could they leave their faith? And then there's another one having to do with the notion that, well, obviously, if you marry somebody who's not Jewish and you're Jewish, or if you're really a good Christian and you don't marry somebody who's Christian, you obviously just don't give a you know what about your faith. You don't give a you know what about your tradition. Those are the myths related to why it is that it cannot work.
So I don't think I would take the affirmative on any of those. I think I agree that those are all myths because I think those are painted very starkly. I will say with the kid who is involved in both Jewish and Christianity and saying they're just both different glimpses of God, right? That is already, you know, a non-dogmatic approach to tradition, which I take for Judaism, so I like it. But, you know, if I was a religious Catholic listening to this podcast, I'd probably said, oh, this kid's just not that religious of a Catholic. And if I was an Orthodox Jew listening to this podcast, I would think, okay, this kid's just not a very religious Jew, because there are sort of, you know, exclusivist claims. You know, if we take any Catholic tradition before the 1960s, right? You know, if this guy popped into, you know, the medieval period, right? That's not an answer that would have been able to.
But you gave us the answer right there. You said before the 60s. With Nostra Aetate and with Pope John Paul, I always forget which one it is, who actually said that Jews are not the killers of Jesus, and who said that they are our brothers, that there's a brotherhood here, that did the job of making it less orthodox in a lowercase o thinking. That's what's necessary. There is a need. If you're going to be in an interfaith relationship, you have to be willing to be flexible in what is it that I'm comfortable with? What is it that I'm able to surround my family with, to be a part of? But here's the thing about that, okay? And this goes back to one of the Halakhic points that I was mentioning earlier. Would love for you to share, if you could in some way, the actual text of this, which is from Tosefta Avodah Zarah. Tosefta Avodah Zarah, and Tosefta, it refers to a collection of early rabbinic sayings that did not get into the canon, and yet they're still a part of the canon. Because I love us Jews. Like, we always think it's part of the book, but even the ones that don't make it in are still a part of the book. All right? So Tosefta Avodah Zarah, this is, if you want to follow along, it's chapter 5, Mishnah 2. And it's what's talking about that I want to raise here is, what does it mean to be a Jew living in a world where it's not just fellow Jews? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Jews, or he refers to them as Israel, that is outside the land, worship idols with purity. The Hebrew of it is Rav Shimon ben Elazar Omer Yisrael shebachutza la'aretz ovdei avodat kochavim betaharahen. Literally, it is, we are these ovdei kochavim, these non-Jews, even if you want to go even starker, these idolaters who are pure. What does it mean here? And if you go down further in the text, what it's really saying is this. Like the people of that land, those idol worshipers, they go to make a feast for their child, and they go and invite all of the Jews in the city. Even the Jews who eat and drink and serve from their own stuff, or to put another way, that Jews are trying to keep kosher as much as possible. I would say it's kind of like, I don't know, saying I want to eat hot dairy out at a restaurant. That is a version of my version of kashrut. But I have to be comfortable with the fact that I know what's being made in the back of the kitchen that's not having anybody looking at it. It's probably going to have some stuff in it. But as long as I'm doing the best that I can, that they are considered to be Jews who are actually like idol worshipers, but they're good enough. They're idol worshipers who are b'tahara. That text is really important in thinking about the psychology of what it means to be a Jew in the diaspora, which does two things. The first is that there's almost this negative sentiment of the fact that by living amongst other people, we are going to be losing our sense of who we are. However, even in the midst, we still need to find a way to live, and it requires us to be less orthodox, again, lowercase o, in our thinking and in our approach.
I agree with you. Just the pushback I would give is everything's going to be a matter of how much you want to stretch this out. So that argument could, exactly what you just said, I could almost imagine, because I've been rereading Samson Raphael Hirsch I'm teaching a class on modern Jewish thought. So he gives a similar type of argument as to why it makes sense for Jews to learn German instead of just speaking Yiddish. He's like, listen, we gotta, interact with the culture. We're not going to be, hold the ultra-Orthodox line. And that was sort of his, he was, just for listeners, one of the, founders of what we now know to be modern Orthodoxy. But there's always going to be a line, meaning like another line of, because I can almost imagine someone taking that argument, which I agree with, the general argument you're making, and say, why should we cling to any type of Jewish identity then? Like, listen, we're in a postmodernist America, post-ethnic, almost end of faith like time. Like, why keep any of the vestiges of this religious tradition?
Because Jewish is awesome, man. Jewish is awesome. Like, it's awesome to be connected to this tradition. And like, I think that you've experienced this in your own way, and I've experienced it in my own way. And hopefully for many of the listeners listening right now, that wherever you are in your own Jewish journey, there's something about it that's like, this is amazing. Like, I remember just dancing into USY and Ramah programs and just singing my head off. Like, my son was like, every time when we visited him at camp, like, he lost his voice because they're busy belting out Zmirot during Friday night and for Friday night dinner, after Friday night dinner. And it's awesome. So I don't accept that notion of the slippery slope, because there's always going to be that sense of tradition and change. That's my
I don't know if it's a slippery. I'm just thinking. I'm not really sure if it's a slippery slope, because I agree. I'm not a fan of slippery slope arguments. I always like to joke. We just had a baby 6 months ago, but before, thank you. I was a big rock climber and mountaineer, so climbing up snowy mountains. So I've always joked slippery slopes have never dissuaded me. Is sort of the joke that I often.
But here's my question then, right? When you're on a rock, when you're rock climbing, how do you feel secure enough that you don't have to hold on to the wall, but you can actually take a moment to appreciate the view? How do you know that you're stable enough? Because, by the way, I'm a terrible rock climber. I can never get like high enough. Like, in that moment, how do you know that you're actually not going to slip?
Mixture of trust, practice. If you're not careful, we'll end up talking for 3 hours about rock climbing, because I can go on many tangents there.
But that point about trust and knowledge, that you are aware of the skill of how to be able to be comfortable, that allows you to be able to recognize, I can stand on this mountain and appreciate the view that it gives me. For me, and as a conservative rabbi, as a conservative Jew, and on this issue, halakha gives me a way in, and gives any Jew a way in, to be able to see the possibility of intermarriage from a strong vantage point. That is, if I'm standing on a mountain and I have my foot, my toe, I don't even know how it's possible to make that happen. Like, standing on a toe, but feeling secure enough because I know what I'm doing. Because
so if we follow this analogy
on that wall, and it doesn't mean that we're just not going to slip at all, but we believe that we feel comfortable enough to take that look.
So if we do follow this analogy, I think it's an interesting analogy.
I like this.
I'm gonna take it to a place that I don't think you're gonna like, but
I cannot wait for that.
I'll play around with it.
Please.
For somebody who's an experienced rock climber, they can stay up and do that. If you take somebody who's never climbed before and you put them in the middle of a wall, they are just going to freak out. I've done it before. I've taken friends rock climbing, and I generally am not some like a start on level 1 type person. And so 200 feet up a rock face is not when you want to hear from your friend that they are just absolutely terrified and can't move. And so in the equivalent, I think you're giving a very idealistic portrayal that I think I'm pretty sympathetic to, of like, listen, if for whatever reason, my life path, I am happily married, but let's say 10 years ago, I met and married a non-Jewish woman. I'm fairly confident, because of, who I am and my background and my commitment to Judaism. I don't know how much it would change, so I think I agree with you there a little bit. I do want to bring up kids in a second, because I think this is also an interesting, down product. But for the average American Jew who doesn't really have that background, who's trying to figure out what is their Jewish identity, for Jewish educators, because this is why I open with Lechatchila and B'diavad, or the, a priori or post facto, because I think it actually might interestingly speak to the two different groups of people we're dealing with. You're talking about officiating weddings. So by the time somebody's already ready to have their wedding officiated, one, they're probably hopefully older than 18 or 19. Two, they've already made sort of an affirmative choice, to which case the whole a priori situation already goes out the window. This is already, two people come and they say, we care about Judaism enough that we want our ceremony to be intertwined and Jewish and have a rabbi there. I think that's pretty great, right? There's a separate way to view it, from the other side, which is your average American Jew entering a campus. They're 19 years old. They are potentially having a relationship with a rabbi for the first time in their life, and dating and marriage comes up, because what else are 19-year-olds thinking about? And
right, we're calling it dating and marriage. That's what they're thinking.
Sure, yeah. And inevitably, I mean, the amount of times I get asked by a student about, should I only date Jews, non-Jews? I mean, it's multiple times a week. So there, it seems like it makes sense a little bit to not to say you'll be a terrible person and you're going to lose your Jewish identity and none of those myths that you brought up. It's not you're abandoning your tradition and blah blah blah, but just in a very honest way, being like, listen, if you envision yourself living a Jewish life and want to maximize the chance that your kids will have a full Jewish identity and want all of these things, it just forget halacha, because most of these students, again, are not, Shomer Shabbat, and they're not, doing all the other halachic things, but simply just saying, it just makes, sociologic sense for you to do this. It will increase the chances that your family will be Jewish and you'll have, all the nomenkers of a Jewish community, right? Your, Franz Rosenzweig, your books will be, you'll have more than just 2 Jewish books on your bookshelf, and you'll have some Shabbat practice, and, every year you'll do something around the Jewish holidays. It just seems like a worthwhile nudge. And then if a student comes back to me 6 years later and I haven't talked to them in a while and they said, Rabbi, I met this person and we're in love and they're incredible, and I meet them and I'm like, okay, this seems like a great person, and they're supportive of their future spouse's Jewish journey and everything like that, that's a whole other situation. That's a situation where I would say, okay, what am I gonna, I'm not gonna, kick them out the door, right? That's not the approach of, say, Hillel over Shammai in the, Talmudic story of, being welcoming. And so these are, I don't know if you want to comment on this. I do want to talk about, I'll just bring up the question of children for a second, and then if you want, you can sort of bounce back to this other point. Probably the students I know that are in the toughest life circumstances. This is, by the way, the number one question. It's so funny because I speak at a lot of shuls, and the first question that everybody, or the only question that people have for me is, how is anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campus? It is a real thing, but but I always tell them, like, the question that both I and the most amount of students are most conflicted on is this question. And I'll give you the thesis. The thesis is that, especially outside of traditional Jewish strongholds such as, say, New York, and you mentioned Philly before, the Jewish community is sort of splintered between liberal communities, so you're Reform and Reconstructionist and conservative, and then Chabad, right? Chabad is gaining steam. They're incredibly popular. Every campus, it's Chabad and Hillel. These are the two groups. They're split about 50-50. Not to say students don't go to both. Obviously, Chabad has if you're not halachically Jewish, you're not Jewish, right? So that means, just to spell out for listeners, you are only Jewish if you have a halachically Jewish mother or converted, but let's, put aside conversion for a second. In other words, if a Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman, according to Orthodoxy and also conservative, that kid is not Jewish. Now, if a kid, most of my students are growing up in non-Orthodox homes and communities, so it's fine, but then they get to college, and the Jewish community is much more post-denominational than it's been before. I don't know where you stand on denominations. I'm going to guess you would probably agree with me.
Right now I'm kind of post-denominational.
Sure. So I've always viewed myself as that is very fair. I hope it's not too soon.
Not too soon.
So I've always kind of viewed myself as post-denominational. Yeah. And post-denominationalism is great because I don't need to hold up the tenets of any one denomination, which, denominations are also basically fake. They're 150 years old. They're only Ashkenazi, right? My wife is Persian. They've never heard of Orthodox and conservative and Reform until they came to America from Iran. So, like, for all the reasons that we can, sit here talking about, I don't think denominations make any sense. The downstream effect of that, however, is because the Jewish community is merging into a much more, post-denominational soup. Students who are patrilineally Jewish, and I do affirm the Jewishness of patrilineal Jews, so I'll just shout that out. I've talked about this on the podcast before, but the likeliness of your average 20-year-old Jew who grows up, say, in Orange County, California, which is where I am, to come into contact with Chabad or with non-Ashkenazi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Israelis, Persians, if you're New York Syrians, who will explicitly say, oh, you're not Jewish. This is probably about 30% of students of mine, and it's an incredibly difficult situation because the Hillel movement affirms their Jewishness. They can go on birthright. They're eligible for the right of return. If they ask me, Rabbi, am I Jewish? I will say yes. And yet, the other half of the Jewish community, they're always going to view them, at best, with an asterisk, at worst, with is just like I'm so sorry, maybe you're ethnically Jewish, but you're not actually, Jewishly Jewish or halakhically Jewish. I don't really know. This isn't really an argument. This is me giving this story because this is a situation I see all the time, and I don't know what the best way to deal with this is. The cat's already out of the bag, right? To say, okay, therefore, nobody can marry somebody who's not Jewish, right? That's, we can shout that from the rooftops, right? So this is already a situation where a plurality of non-Orthodox American Jews, their halachic status as Jews is already questionable. But I'm curious what you do with that and if you differentiate based on patrilineal, matrilineal, thinking about that from a children perspective.
Let me start with some proof for your point. Okay. Philo of Alexandria, which, by the way, Alexandria, Egypt, was perhaps one of the greatest and most forgotten Jewish diasporas in history, he wrote about intermarriage. And here's what he said. He said that you should not enter into the partnership of marriage with a member of a foreign nation, lest someday, conquered by the forces of opposing customs, you surrender and stray unawares from the path that leads to piety and turn aside into a pathless wild. All right? It's kind of like the argument about King Solomon, of how he just lost his way because of who he married. But this is the main thing, and has having to do with the point about you will find your way, but what about your children? And perhaps you will yourself resist if you have been from your earliest youth trained in the best possible instruction, right? Somebody who grew up in a very Jewish household, they're going to remain Jewish no matter what in terms of their relationship with whoever it may be. I met plenty of interfaith couples who, let's say the Jewish individual is like, doesn't want to touch the Christmas tree, or that they have certain views of non-Jews based upon the fact that it's almost as if they did not marry somebody who wasn't Jewish. So it doesn't, our upbringing definitely does a lot to tell us about who it is that we are. So you may not necessarily be any different. And the anxiety and the fear which parents feel for their sons and daughters is not slight, for perchance they may be allured by mischievous customs instead of genuine good ones. And so they may be in danger of learning to forget the honor belonging to the one God, which is the beginning and end of unextreme unhappiness. Okay? So that's basically making the point of you yourself might be fine, but it's your children we're worried about. Here's the crux of the Halakhic idea for interfaithing. And this comes, and if anybody wants to listen, I just dropped an emergency podcast episode after the article was dropped, where Anna and I talked about the basic Halakhic argument, of which I have composed a 90-page tshuva, which really is going through all the sources, unpacking them, understanding them, seeing any source related to intermarriage and how how Judaism or how the rabbis, how Torah understands it. And within that there's an argument to be made. This is what that argument really is. If you are in a relationship where you're afraid to touch a Christmas tree, where you don't want to have any possible interaction with a non-Jewish anything because you yourself feel something, and that you're worried about your children, about the engagement that they have, so you try to resist and say, you know what, we're just going to do the Jewish thing, that fear of the other is still really there, and that is the prohibition against intermarriage. The prohibition against intermarriage is intertwined with the prohibition against idolatry, as it appears in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, primarily because the fear is the influence of another way of being, not just upon you, but upon your children and upon your household, and that we should be fearful of that. The only way to halakhically understand the possibility that intermarriage could work is to not be fearful. How we do that? Happy to come back and talk about that another time. Because I think that the how we are not fearful is very much about what does it mean to be a Jew living in the modern world? What does it mean to be a Jew living amongst other nations? Last point I want to make related to not just with kids, but also to the point you raised about the understanding of Jewishness, especially on campus. So my Saba, my grandfather, Rabbi Alexander Shapiro, Zichrono Livracha, one of the things that he was also very big about was the idea of interdenominational relationships. So I believe that when he was president of the Rabbinical Assembly, forget if it was 1985, 1986 or so, it was the only time in American Jewish history that in one convention, you had the leader of the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, and the Orthodox movement coming to speak at a denominational convention. And for my grandfather, that he was invited to speak at the Orthodox convention and then the Reform convention that year, because he believed that we were really supposed to matter to one another. Kol Yisrael arevim zeh bazeh. The idea that we're all responsible for each other. So I got a copy of what my grandfather said when he went to the Reform Rabbinical Association meeting. And it was at this time that the Reform movement actually said, we now accept patrilineal Jews. And my grandfather said, with all due respect, stop it. Don't do it. Why? For the purposes of Klal Yisrael. For the purposes of what he said is that if you move away from this, then we're going to become what he called sifrei yochsin. We're going to become all about who is related to who, like which side is Jewish or not. And by the way, I think if you actually look at the Halakhic literature, it is not clear that not either patrilineal or matrilineality actually guarantees Jewishness. I think the clear Halakhic argument is that patrilineality or matrilineality give you the option of identifying as a Jew, but then you have to take that step and say, okay, I am a Jew, and then you're welcome. The point being that what he was trying to do is to say, if we're going to be all united together, we need to work under the same rubric and framework. Ultimately, it's about who we consider to be part of our community. And now I'm speaking a little bit more personally as a conservative rabbi who also was the rabbi of a conservative synagogue in suburban New York at this one particular time. We had an Orthodox shul, a conservative shul, and a Reform shul, and a Reconstruction shul down the street. The Orthodox shul didn't really have much of a relationship with. It was the Reform shul and the conservative shul especially that there was a question of whether or not you would become a member of either one. That is to say, our community was considered to be the conservative and the Reform movement. So what my grandfather said back then about Klal Yisrael, that of wanting to become more inclusive of all Jews, sadly, that tendency of what I saw when I was a rabbi on Long Island is also seen in many, many places in which the Jews who are willing to come together and see each other as Jews are separated between Orthodox and non-Orthodox institutions.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely right. I mean, the state of Israel also obviously plays a role with different definitions of right of return versus the Rabbanut. I have another student who's actually moved to Israel and is now dealing with their questionable Jewish identity now between the Rabbanut after being eligible, of course, for the right of return. Again, this is not a, this particular problem is not a, what is the easy fix? I think that both sides have arguments that make so much sense. But
here's the other thing, by the way. And I think this actually comes back to the conservative argument, right? You said conservative Judaism says specifically that, and by the way, my grandfather was also very instrumental in ensuring that matrilineality was going to be at the forefront of the movement for many years and still is today. That if you're going to do an intermarriage, you have to be willing to accept patrilineal as well. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense.
Mm.
Like, how would it be possible to say, I'm willing to be part of a wedding between a Jew and somebody who's not Jewish and say yes to this, but your child, nope, your child's not Jewish because it's the wrong side of the family. I don't think that makes sense. So I think that the halacha has to be able to be done sort of in tandem there. And I believe that there is an argument for that, but that's also for another time.
Sure. Just some final thoughts. Thank you so much. Listeners don't know this, but I'll just give a shout out. I messaged you, I think, 2 hours ago on Facebook.
Yep.
And so this was the quickest podcast, from time of reaching out to actually recording I've ever had. So thank you for being so available.
My pleasure.
A lot of fun. I'll try to put this up by Thursday, August 14th, so we can get this up
Sounds great.
Quickly. I think where I land, and this is just sort of my concluding thoughts, and I think this is super interesting. I think everyone listening to this probably either comes away with very strong opinions, either they love you or hate you, or they are coming out of here with a lot of new thoughts, and in which case I think both are good. I think at the end of the day, the sort of given everything we talked about, the sort of welcoming, especially if you're not an Orthodox rabbi, I think Orthodoxy is sort of a separate thing. But if you're not a non-Orthodox rabbi, I think inclusivity and welcomingness has to be sort of the name of the game. That said, I still land, and this is also, I'll throw out one more, out of left field. You don't have to comment on this, but it's not a topic I think about a lot. I have helped numerous people do non-Orthodox conversion. So let's say through the Reform movement. And one of the things that I'm very adamant that they understand is that they will not be seen as Jewish according to the entire Jewish world and according to the Rabbanut in Israel, because I don't think it does them any favors to say, yes, you're fully Jewish. And then the next time they, go to Israel.
I do the same thing, even though what I do is a Halakhic conversion, at least in the way that conservative movement has said it, but saying this is for this community. It's not about Kol Yisrael, like not everybody. It's this community. And unfortunately, it doesn't mean it's going to be recognized by everybody, but it will be recognized by many.
Sure. So thank you again. Like any good Jewish question, I think most listeners are probably left with more questions than they have specific answers, but that's the fun of all this. So Ari, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Daniel, for reaching out, and would love to continue the conversation in any way that you would like into the future.
100%.